Winifred Doyle sighted down the barrel of her father's Sharps rifle and did not let her hands shake, though everything inside her chest was shaking plenty. "Get off Doyle land," she said. "I will not tell you twice." The rider did not move his horse, and he did not raise his hands the way most men did when a woman had a rifle trained on their heart. He only studied her from beneath the brim of a gray hat gone pale with trail dust, as though he were deciding whether she meant it. "I have business with whoever holds this deed," he said. His voice was low, unhurried, the kind of voice that made a body want to trust it, which only made Winifred angrier, because Jed Calloway had told her exactly what kind of business this man conducted, and it was not the kind that got settled with polite words at a fence line. "I hold the deed," she said. "Winifred Doyle. My father is dead 6 weeks, and I expect you already knew that, since I hear you are the one who marked the trail that put him under all that snow." Something crossed his face then, quick as a hawk's shadow gone before she could name it. He eased back in the saddle slow and lowered the hand that had been resting near his hip. "Marked what trail?" he said. "Granite Pass." "The survey stakes. Jed Calloway says you walked that canyon last autumn for Ezra Thorne, marking where the snow would run heaviest come spring, so a man chasing stolen cattle up that draw would never see the slide coming until it had already buried him." For a long moment the only sound was the creek behind the house, swollen and loud with meltwater, and the wind moving through the black oaks along the ridge. The stranger's jaw tightened. "I have never worked for Ezra Thorne a day in my life," he said. "And I did not know your father was dead until this very second, Miss Doyle, and I am sorrier for it than you have any cause to believe. Words are cheap, mister. Jed Calloway does not lie for free, and he told half the men at the mercantile that you were seen in Thorne's office not 3 days past, taking his money. I was in Thorne's office because he is chairman of the town council that hired me to raise a schoolhouse and a bridge, and every carpenter in this county has to pass through that door to get paid for lumber. That is the whole of it." He held her gaze steady. "My name is Oliver Garrett. If you would lower that rifle a moment, I expect we could speak like reasonable people." The name struck her like a hand against still water, rings spreading out in every direction. Oliver Garrett. She had not heard it spoken aloud in 6 years, and she had certainly never expected to hear it come from the mouth of the man himself, sitting a saddle horse at her father's broken fence with the spring runoff roaring behind him. She did not lower the rifle. If anything, her grip tightened, because now there were 2 kinds of danger in front of her, and she was not sure which frightened her more. "Oliver," she said, testing the word. "Winifred." Something in his face gentled just at the edges, the way ice gentles at the first warm day of the year. "It has been a long while." Before she could answer, 3 riders broke from the tree line at the north edge of the pasture at a dead run, and the moment split apart like dropped glass. She recognized Jed Calloway's black hat first, and behind him 2 men she did not know, all 3 bearing down on the barn with torches already lit despite the daylight, because a man carrying fire in broad day meant to be seen, meant to send a message rather than hide a crime. Winifred swung the rifle toward them without thinking, but the distance was too great and her breath came too fast, and she knew even as she fired a warning shot into the dirt that it would not be enough to stop 3 armed men from doing what they had ridden out to do. Oliver Garrett was already moving. He put his horse between Winifred and the riders in one hard motion, drew a pistol from beneath his coat with a speed that told her plainly this was not his first gunfight despite his claim of being nothing more than a carpenter, and fired once into the air. "That is close enough," he called out, and there was iron in his voice now, nothing gentle left in it at all. "Turn around or the next one finds a horse instead of the sky." Calloway reined up hard enough that his mount nearly sat back on its haunches. "Garrett," he said, and there was surprise in it, real surprise, which told Winifred something important, though she did not have time yet to sort out what. "This is not your fight. You are 3 men with torches bearing down on a woman's barn in daylight," Oliver said. "You made it my fight the moment you crossed that tree line." The 2 riders behind Calloway exchanged a look, and Winifred understood in that instant that they had not expected anyone else to be there. They had watched the ranch, waited for her to be alone, and Oliver Garrett arriving at the fence not 10 minutes before had ruined whatever careful plan Thorne had drawn up. "Mr. Thorne only wants what is owed him," Calloway said. "Doyle's herd was mortgaged against a debt that never got paid before he died. This is a matter of business. Then let it be settled in a courthouse with a judge and a ledger, not with torches and 3 men against 1 woman," Oliver said. "Ride on, Calloway." "Tell Thorne I said as much." For a moment nobody moved, and the creek roared on behind them all, indifferent. Then Calloway spat into the dirt, wheeled his horse, and the 3 of them rode back the way they had come, though not before Calloway threw one last look over his shoulder at Winifred that promised this was not finished. Winifred lowered her rifle slowly, her arms aching from the strain of holding it steady so long, and found that her legs had gone unreliable beneath her. She sat down hard on the porch step and did not trust herself to speak for a moment. Oliver dismounted and came to stand a respectful distance away, not close enough to crowd her, close enough to be heard. "You are hurt?" he asked. "No." She looked up at him, and 6 years fell away and came rushing back all at once. The boy she had known folded somewhere inside this broader, harder man, the same steady brown eyes but with new lines etched around them, the same way of standing like he was rooted to whatever ground he chose to occupy. "You are the last man I expected to see standing between me and Ezra Thorne's riders, Oliver Garrett." "I expect I am the last man you wanted to see at all," he said, and there was old hurt in it, carefully covered. "I did not say that. You aimed a rifle at me and accused me of murdering your father. I did not accuse you of murder. I accused you of marking a trail." She stood brushing dust from her skirt, needing the motion to steady herself. "Though I suppose you are right that it amounts to the same thing, in the end, if it is true." "It is not true," he said. "I walked Granite Pass in October, yes, for a road survey the county wanted for a summer freight route, nothing to do with cattle trails or Thorne's business. I filed those maps with the county surveyor in Placerville myself. If someone has used my work to send men to their deaths, they did it without my knowledge and against my will, and I will not rest easy until I know the truth of it." Winifred studied him a long moment. She had learned, in 6 years of teaching herself to read faces the way her father had taught her to read cattle brands and weather, that liars rarely met your eyes so steadily while offering to prove themselves wrong. But she had also learned, more bitterly, that charm and honesty did not always live in the same house, and that the last time she had trusted this particular man's steady eyes, he had ridden east without so much as a letter and left her 17 and foolish, and certain the fault must have been her own. "You may prove it then," she said finally. "Or you may ride on, same as Calloway. Either way, I thank you for the help just now, and I will not pretend I am not grateful for it. But do not mistake gratitude for trust, Mr. Garrett. I have not got much of that left to spare these days." Something like a smile touched the corner of his mouth, sad and knowing. "I would not dream of mistaking the two, Miss Doyle. I have learned that particular lesson already, and I paid for it dear." The spring of 1854 had come to the Sierra foothills wearing 2 faces at once, both of them dangerous. By day the sun fell warm and golden through the black oaks and the last stands of ponderosa pine, coaxing green up through soil that had spent 5 hard years giving up its gold to men with pans and cradles and, later, great groaning stamp mills that had gone silent one by one as the easy color played out. By night the temperature dropped hard enough to remind every soul in the foothill towns that above them, not so very far, the high Sierra still wore a winter's worth of snow, and more of it than any old-timer could recall in a decade. The talk in Pine Hollow's single mercantile was all of the melt, how fast it was coming, how the passes would run with water and worse before summer settled in for good. Pine Hollow itself was a town built on the bones of a played-out placer camp, its false-fronted buildings strung along a single dirt street that turned to soup every time it rained, Its fortunes shifted now from gold dust to cattle and timber, the only two things left in these hills worth a man's labor. It had a mercantile, a boarding house, a blacksmith, a saloon that did more business than all the rest combined, and a cattle exchange and bank presided over by Ezra Thorne, a man who had arrived in 1850 with nothing but a strongbox and a talent for numbers, and had since become the richest man for 30 miles in any direction. It also, as of 6 weeks past, had no proper marshal to speak of, not one worth the tin star he wore. Marshal Amos Prout had held the office 3 years, ever since the last man had been shot dead in a mining camp dispute, and nobody else had wanted the job. And in that time, Prout had learned that it was a great deal easier and more profitable to look the other way when Ezra Thorne's name came up in a complaint than to press the matter. Winifred Doyle understood all of this better than most, because her father, Samuel Doyle, had spent the last year of his life trying to press the matter anyway. She sat that evening at her father's writing desk, the same desk where she had done her lessons as a girl before her mother died and her father had sent her east to her aunt in Ohio for schooling, the same desk where, 3 days after his funeral, she had found a ledger book hidden beneath a false bottom in the lower drawer, its pages filled with her father's careful hand recording every head of cattle he had sold, every brand he had registered, every discrepancy he had noticed between his own tally and the numbers Ezra Thorne's exchange had posted. She had not shown the ledger to anyone. She had not known who could be trusted with it, in a town where the marshal answered to the very man the ledger accused. She had thought, in her grief, that perhaps the safest course was silence, that perhaps she would simply sell what remained of the herd, take what money Thorne's exchange offered her for it, and put all her hope into the schoolhouse instead, a thing purely her own, untouched by cattle or brands or her father's dangerous suspicions. But Jed Calloway's torches that afternoon had told her plainly that silence bought her nothing. Thorne wanted the land, not merely the cattle upon it, and a woman alone with no cattle left to protect would find herself with no reason to stay at all, which was, she suspected now, precisely the point. A knock came at her door near dusk, and she opened it with the rifle still within easy reach, to find Oliver Garrett standing on her porch with his hat in his hands, looking, for the first time since she had known him, uncertain of his welcome. "I came to mend the fence your friends broke this afternoon," he said. "And I thought you should know I sent a letter by tonight's mail rider to the county surveyor in Placerville, asking him to confirm my October filing, so there is a record independent of my own word. That was not necessary. It was entirely necessary, Miss Doyle, because you looked at me today like a woman deciding whether to believe a snake or a scorpion, and I found I did not care for either comparison." He said it without heat, almost gently, and it startled a short laugh out of her before she could stop it. "Come in, then," she said, surprising herself. "I have coffee, and I think I owe you an explanation, even if I am not yet ready to owe you my trust." They sat at the small kitchen table, the same one where her father had eaten 10,000 suppers, and she told him what Calloway had told the men at the mercantile, and what her father had believed before he died, and at last, haltingly, about the hidden ledger. Oliver listened without interrupting, turning his coffee cup slowly between his hands, and when she finished he was quiet a long moment. "Your father believed Thorne was altering brands," he said. "Buying cattle at rustled prices and running a hot iron over the Circle D to make it read as his own double T, then selling the same beef twice over in his books to cover the difference. You make it sound like you already knew." "I did not know, but I have spent 6 years building bridges and grading roads from the Feather River clear down to the Merced, and I have seen this trick before, in 3 different counties, always the same shape to it. A man with money enough to hold mortgages over small ranchers, a bank ledger nobody thinks to check because the man holding the pen is the same man who owns the paper, and a marshal too poorly paid or too poorly principled to look twice." He set the cup down. "It is an old thief's trick wearing new clothes, Winifred. I only wonder that your father was the first man brave enough to write it down. He was not the first to notice. He was only the first fool enough to go looking for proof of it himself, up Granite Pass in March, chasing a rustled herd he thought Thorne's men were driving up toward the summer range to hide until the brands could be worked over properly. Her voice caught, and she pressed on before it could break entirely. They found him 3 days later, when the snow slid again, and uncovered what the first slide had buried. The county coroner called it an accident of weather. I have never quite believed that a man who grew up in these mountains, who could read snow the way you read your own name, would walk himself into a slide path by pure bad luck. Oliver reached across the table, not quite touching her hand, close enough that she felt the warmth of it. Then we had better find out whether he was murdered Winifred Doyle, because if he was, I mean to see the man who did it answer for it, whether it is Thorne himself or some fool of a foreman he sent up that canyon to make certain a curious rancher never came back down. She repeated. I do not recall asking for a partner in this. You did not. I am offering myself as one anyway, since I find I am already tangled up in it. What with a schoolhouse to build for a town your ledger says is being robbed blind, and a fence to mend for a woman who once, a very long time ago, meant a great deal more to me than I ever told her plainly enough. The words hung in the small kitchen, and Winifred found she could not quite look at him, because 6 years of careful armor had not prepared her for how easily he could still find the soft place beneath it. That was a long time ago, she said. You left. I did. And I have had 6 years to regret the manner of it, if not the reasons, and I do not intend to spend our second chance at conversation relitigating an old wound when there is a living danger sitting at your door this very night. He stood, collecting his hat. I will mend your fence at first light. After that, if you will permit it, I would like to see this ledger of your father's for myself. She let him go with only a nod, and stood a long while at the window watching his shape recede down the dark road toward town, and told herself sternly that the unsteady feeling in her chest was only the aftermath of the day's fright, and nothing at all to do with the particular set of his shoulders, or the particular way he had said her whole name, as though it were something worth savoring. The schoolhouse rose slowly on a half-acre lot the town council had granted at the eastern edge of Pine Hollow, its raw pine frame standing pale against the darker hills behind it. Oliver worked on it most mornings, and most mornings Winifred found some reason to walk past with a basket of mending or a pretense of errands, until by the second week neither of them bothered pretending any longer, and she simply brought him coffee at mid-morning and sat on a stack of unplaned boards to watch him work while they talked. There are men in this town, she told him one such morning, who think a schoolhouse is an extravagance. Enoch Fairweather at the Mercantile told me plain to my face that ranch children have no need of Latin declensions when they will spend their lives punching cattle and mending fence. Enoch Fairweather also owes Thorne's exchange a debt on his storefront, Oliver said, not looking up from the joint he was fitting. I would wager a man like that says whatever Thorne wishes said, especially about a school that might teach ranch children's fathers' sons to read a ledger well enough to catch him cheating. You think Thorne opposes the school for that reason? I think a schoolhouse full of children who grow up able to add a column of figures is bad for any man's business who has built his fortune on other people's inability to check his math. He set down his hammer and looked at her properly. Your father wanted this school for you, did he not? He wanted it for the whole valley. But yes, I think mostly he wanted it for me, because I loved teaching in Ohio and he thought I had given up too much of myself coming back here to nurse him after Mother died and keep the ranch books. She smiled, a little sad. He used to say a woman ought to have something entirely her own, that no man could mortgage or brand or take from her by force. I did not understand until lately how much he meant that as a warning as well as a wish. He sounds as though he was a man worth knowing. He would have liked you, I think, once he got past the business of you having broken his daughter's heart. She said it lightly, testing the ground. Oliver's hand stilled on the wood. "I did not mean to break anything, Winifred. My father had written that the bridge contracts on the American River were failing without a second pair of trained hands, and mine was the only trade in the family that could answer it. I thought, God forgive my foolish pride, that a wandering carpenter with no roof of his own had no business asking a girl of 17 to wait on the uncertain hope that he might someday build one. You might have asked me anyway and let me decide for myself whether I wished to wait." "I might have," he agreed quietly. "It is among the longer list of things I would do differently, given the chance again." She held his gaze a moment, feeling something shift and settle between them, some old debt not quite paid but at least finally acknowledged. "Well," she said, standing and brushing sawdust from her skirt, "you have your chance now, Oliver Garrett, to prove you have learned something in 6 years besides how to fit a mortise joint." "I intend to," he said, and the promise in it sat warm in her chest the whole walk home. They pored over Samuel Doyle's ledger together that same week, by lamplight at Winifred's kitchen table, comparing his careful entries against the public postings Thorne's exchange put up each month in the mercantile window, entries that Winifred had begun quietly copying down on her own visits to town. "Here," Oliver said, tapping a page. "Your father sold 40 head in September. All bearing the Circle D. Thorne's book records the purchase of only 22 head from Doyle stock that month. And then, 3 weeks later, a sale of 60 head under the Double T brand to a buyer in Sacramento, at nearly double the price your father would have gotten. He is running a hot iron over my father's brand and doubling his money on cattle he never paid for. Worse than that. Look at the count. 40 from you, but only 60 total sold under his own brand that whole season, when Thorne's own herd, by the tax assessor's rolls, never numbered more than 30 head to begin with. He has been doing this to more ranchers than your father alone. Small outfits, men without the standing or the ink to keep their own books so carefully. Your father was likely the only one who noticed at all, because he was the only one keeping a private ledger to check against." Winifred sat back, feeling the shape of the whole scheme settle into place, ugly and enormous. If he confronted Thorne with this before he died, then Thorne had every reason in the world to want him silenced, and Granite Pass gave him the means to make it look like nothing more than bad luck and heavy snow. Oliver's jaw tightened. "We will need more than a private ledger to prove it in any court, Winifred. We need Thorne's own books, or a witness willing to testify against him, and men afraid enough of losing their own mortgaged land are not likely to volunteer either easily. Then we will have to be clever about how we ask." She looked at him, a plan already forming behind her eyes, the same stubborn light he remembered from a girl of 17 who had once talked her way past a Sacramento steamboat captain to see the engine room simply because she wished to understand how it worked. "The spring auction is in 3 weeks, when every rancher for 30 miles brings what stock survived the winter to sell before the summer drive up to the high pasture. Thorne will have to post his tallies publicly, same as always, for the buyers coming up from Sacramento to bid against each other honestly. If we can get my father's ledger, and enough of these other small ranchers' word alongside it, in front of those buyers and whatever county officials attend, Thorne cannot simply have Marshal Prout make the trouble disappear. Too many eyes from outside the valley would be watching. It is a sound plan," Oliver said slowly, "and a dangerous one, if Thorne learns of it before the auction and decides 3 weeks is too long to wait before making certain you never speak at all." "Then we had better be careful," Winifred said, "and quick." She was not careful enough, or perhaps Thorne's men were simply everywhere in a town that small, because within the week the trouble came calling in earnest. It began with the schoolhouse. Winifred arrived one gray morning to find the stack of finished siding boards, seasoned and planed and ready for raising, burned to blackened ruin in the night, and scrawled across the standing frame in charcoal a single crude warning: "Teach your letters elsewhere." Oliver arrived not long after her, and she watched something cold and furious move behind his eyes as he surveyed the damage, though he said nothing rash, only crouched to examine the boot prints in the mud around the ruined lumber. 4 men, he said. Shod horses, town horses, not range stock. This was done by someone who rides for wages, not for cattle. 2 nights after that, someone shot her milk cow dead in the pasture. A clean shot through the skull. No attempt made to butcher the carcass for meat, which told her plainly it had been done for spite and nothing else. And on the 3rd occasion, worse than either, she woke past midnight to the smell of coal oil and found a rag soaked in it smoldering against her porch step, close enough to the dry clapboard siding that another 5 minutes' delay might have cost her the whole house. She beat the small flame out with a wet blanket, hands shaking, and stood afterward in the cold dark yard staring at the scorch mark and understanding at last, fully, what her father must have understood in his own final weeks, that Ezra Thorne did not make idle threats. Oliver came at first light, having heard of the fire from a neighbor riding to fetch the doctor for an unrelated matter, and found her sitting on the step where the fire had nearly taken hold, wrapped in a shawl, staring at nothing. Winifred, he knelt in front of her, taking her cold hands in his without asking leave, and she let him, too tired and too frightened to pretend otherwise. You are not hurt. No. Only frightened half out of my wits, if you must know the truth of it, though I would thank you not to repeat that to anyone in town. I will repeat it to no one but you, and only to say that I do not think less of you for it. A woman who was not frightened by a fire set against her own door would be a fool, and you are no fool, Winifred Doyle. He held her hands a moment longer than strictly necessary, then released them and stood, jaw set. This has gone past what waiting for the auction can answer. I mean to go to the town council today and ask that Pine Hollow deputize me proper, with full authority, until a county marshal can be sent for from Placerville. You said you left the marshal's life behind you. I did. I have not worn a badge in 4 years, not since a man I was sworn to protect in a mining camp dispute up near Nevada City took a bullet meant for me because I was 1/2 second too slow drawing my own iron, and I decided afterward that I had rather build things that stood still and steady than chase men who would not stand still for justice. His voice roughened. But I find I would rather wear that badge again than watch Ezra Thorne burn you out of your own home while I stand by calling myself a carpenter. Oliver, she stood too, facing him. I do not want your badge standing between me and this fight. I do not want to be a woman men look at and say, "Ah, well, Marshal Garrett is minding her, so she must be safe, so we need not trouble ourselves to help her further." I have spent 6 years since Ohio being told what a woman ought to want, ought to need, ought to be minded and managed and protected into. I came home to bury my father and open a school and prove I could stand on land that is mine by right, and I will not now hide behind a man's badge, even yours, and call that standing. I am not asking you to hide, Oliver said, low and urgent. I am asking to stand beside you, which is a different thing entirely, and you know it is, if you will only stop being too proud for a moment to see it plain. They stood close in the gray morning light, the scorch mark on the step between them like a warning neither of them needed spoken aloud, and for a long moment neither one moved nor looked away. Ask the council for your badge if you must, Winifred said finally, softer. I will not stop you, and I will not pretend I am not glad of an ally in this town. But when the day comes to stand in front of Ezra Thorne and call him a thief before every buyer and rancher in the valley, that will be mine to do, Oliver Garrett, with my father's ledger in my own 2 hands. I have earned that much, and I mean to have it. I would not dream of taking it from you, he said, and meant it, and something in his voice told her he understood exactly what she was asking of him, and exactly what it cost her pride to ask it at all. The town council granted Oliver Garrett a deputy's commission the following afternoon, old habits of caution overruling Marshal Pruitt's weak objection. Once 3 separate councilmen recalled, rather suddenly, that they too had noticed odd figures in Thorne's postings over the years, and had simply never dared say so aloud. It was not much, That small badge pinned once more to a carpenter's flannel shirt, but it gave Oliver standing enough to ride the valley openly asking questions, and gave Winifred, though she would not have admitted it plainly, a measure of comfort she had not known she needed until it arrived. They fell in the 2 weeks that followed into an easy rhythm neither of them named aloud as courtship, though it was certainly that. He raised the schoolhouse frame again from fresh lumber, and she brought his midday meal and stayed to hand him nails and once to hold a rafter steady while he set the pitch of the roof, laughing at the sawdust in her hair after. He rode with her twice up toward the lower reaches of Granite Pass, where the snow still lay heavy and treacherous above the tree line, and showed her his old survey stakes, weathered but unmistakably marking a road route well clear of the slide path that had killed her father, proof enough, alongside the surveyor's confirming letter that arrived from Placerville that same week, that whoever had sent Samuel Doyle up that canyon had chosen the ground with murderous intent, using knowledge of the terrain that had nothing to do with Oliver's honest work. One evening, caught in a sudden hard spring rain on the ride back from a neighboring rancher's spread where they had gone to gather a sworn statement about Thorne's cattle dealings, they took shelter in an abandoned line shack half a mile from Winifred's own land, and sat close together before a small fire Oliver coaxed from damp kindling, waiting out the storm. "Tell me something true," Winifred said, watching the fire rather than him. "That has nothing to do with Ezra Thorne or ledgers or brands." Oliver considered this a moment. "I built a bridge once over the Yuba that the flood took clean away not 4 months after I finished it. Nearly broke my heart. I had thought foolishly that if I built a thing sturdy enough, patient enough, it might simply endure the way nothing else in my life ever had. And did you learn otherwise? I learned that a bridge is not meant to fight the river. It is meant to bend with it, to give the water somewhere honest to go, and to trust its own foundation to hold even when the current changes." He looked at her then, firelight warm on the planes of his face. "I have been thinking on that a great deal of late, in ways that have very little to do with bridges." "Oliver Garrett," she said, half laughing, half something else entirely, "are you comparing me to a flooded river?" "I am comparing myself to a fool who once thought love needed to be a fortress rather than a bridge," he said, quiet and serious now, "and who left a good woman standing on one bank because he was too proud and too frightened to build anything that might bend and still hold. I do not wish to make that mistake twice, Winifred, if you will allow me the chance to prove it." She turned to face him fully, rain drumming steady on the old shack roof, the fire between them small and gold. "I am not 17 anymore," she said. "I do not need rescuing, and I will not be managed, not even by a man I am beginning to love as much as I once did 6 years ago before you rode away." "I am not asking to manage you," he said. "I am asking to build something beside you that we might both call home." She kissed him then, or perhaps he kissed her. Neither of them was ever quite certain afterward which of them had closed the last small distance first, only that it felt, at last, like something long delayed finally arriving where it had always been meant to go. The morning of the spring auction dawned clear and cold, the kind of high mountain light that made every distant peak look close enough to touch, snowfields still gleaming white far above the green foothill slopes where cattle grazed on new grass. Pine Hollow's single street filled early with wagons and riders, small ranchers bringing what stock had survived the winter, buyers up from Sacramento in good coats with cash boxes and hired guards, and presiding over all of it from a raised platform outside his own exchange office, Ezra Thorne, a heavy-set man with careful gray whiskers and the unhurried manner of someone who had never once in his life doubted he would win. Winifred rode into town that morning with her father's ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tied secure behind her saddle, alongside 4 sworn statements gathered from neighboring ranchers over the past 2 weeks, each of them willing at last to speak once they understood they would not stand alone. She had asked Oliver, the night before, not to ride in at her side. "I mean to walk up to that platform myself," she had told him, And I mean for every soul in this valley to see a Doyle standing on her own 2 feet accusing Ezra Thorne to his face, not hiding behind a deputy's badge for courage. If it goes wrong, I will send word, and I trust you to come. But let me have this first, Oliver. Let me have the trying of it myself. He had not liked it. She had seen the argument working behind his eyes, the old instinct of a lawman who had watched one bad half-second cost a man his life. But he had nodded finally and said only, "I will not be far, Winifred. Whatever comes, I will not be far." And she had understood that for the compromise it was, the closest thing to a promise he could give without breaking his word to let this be hers. She walked up to the platform alone then, at 9:30 in the morning, while Thorne was midway through announcing the day's opening bids, and her voice, when she raised it, carried clear across the crowded street. "Mr. Thorne," she called, "before this auction proceeds another word, I have a matter of public record I believe every buyer here today has a right to hear." Thorne's smile did not waver, though something went flat and dangerous behind his eyes. "Miss Doyle, this is hardly the place for a young lady's grievances." "It is precisely the place," Winifred said, climbing the 2 steps to stand upon the platform itself, ledger held before her like a shield, "since the grievance concerns the very ledger you are about to use to set today's prices." She turned to face the crowd, buyers and ranchers alike, and unwrapped the oilcloth. "My father, Samuel Doyle, kept careful record of every head of cattle he sold to this exchange across the last 2 years of his life. I have that record here, alongside sworn statements from 4 other ranchers in this valley, showing that Mr. Thorne's public postings understate what was purchased from small outfits, while his own sales, under his own brand, consistently exceed what any honest tally of his herd could account for." A murmur ran through the crowd, buyers exchanging uneasy glances, and Winifred pressed on before her nerve could fail her. "I believe, and I am prepared to show through these documents, that Ezra Thorne has been altering the Circle D brand and others besides into his own double T, paying ranchers a fraction of fair value while reselling that same stock at full price to buyers who have no reason to suspect the count is false. I believe further that my father discovered this scheme before his death, and that his death upon Granite Pass last March was no accident of weather, but the result of men sent to silence him." Thorne's face had gone the color of old ash. "This is a slanderous fantasy, dreamed up by a grieving girl with no head for figures and no business meddling in matters far beyond her understanding." "Then you will have no objection," Winifred said steadily, "to a full accounting of your books conducted here today, before these buyers and before whatever county officials can be summoned from Placerville, so that the truth, whatever it proves to be, may be established beyond any further dispute." It might have ended there with cooler heads prevailing, had Jed Calloway not chosen that exact moment to shoulder his way through the crowd with 3 other of Thorne's riders, hands resting meaningfully on their pistols. "That is enough," Calloway said. "Miss Doyle, you will hand over that ledger, and you will do it now, or we will take it from you by whatever means necessary." The crowd shrank back, buyers and ranchers alike suddenly remembering urgent business at the far edges of the street, and Winifred felt, for the first time that morning, the true weight of standing entirely alone against 4 armed men in the open street, no rifle in her hands, no fence to shelter behind, only a ledger and her own 2 feet planted on a wooden platform. She did not step back. "You will have to take it from a dead woman's hands, then, Mr. Calloway, because I do not intend to surrender it while I am living." Calloway's hand tightened on his pistol grip, and for one long, terrible heartbeat, Winifred believed entirely that he meant to draw on her in front of the whole gathered town. The crack of a rifle shot into the air above the crowd stopped every hand in the street from moving further, and Oliver Garrett came riding hard down the center of Main Street with his deputy's badge bright on his chest, and 3 other men behind him, ranchers he had quietly gathered that same morning, men whose own suspicions of Thorn had needed only a witness willing to stand first before they found their own courage. "Hands off your irons, all of you," Oliver called, reining up hard before the platform, rifle already reloaded and steady. "This town has a deputized officer of the law standing in this street, and I will see any man who draws a weapon against an unarmed woman answer for it before a judge, or before God, whichever comes calling first." Calloway's men hesitated, looking to Thorn for direction, but Thorn himself had gone very still, calculating, and Winifred understood in that instant that a man like Ezra Thorn did not fight fair when cornered. He simply changed the ground beneath everyone's feet entirely. "Calloway," Thorn said, low and urgent, not troubling himself to be quiet enough that Winifred did not hear it. "The East Pens, now." It took Winifred a moment to understand what he meant, and then the sound reached her, a low building rumble from the direction of the auction pens at the edge of town, where 300 head of cattle stood penned awaiting the day's bidding. And she understood with cold horror that Thorn meant to loose the entire herd through the heart of Pine Hollow itself, through the crowded street, through the half-built schoolhouse, through anything and anyone standing between himself and a clean escape from the consequences of his own crimes. The gate crashed open a moment later, and 300 head of frightened, penned cattle, already unsettled by the morning's shouting and gunfire, broke into the street in a solid wall of horn and hide and thundering hooves, buyers and townsfolk scattering in every direction, wagons overturning, the whole of Pine Hollow's main street transformed in an instant into a churning river of terrified livestock with nowhere obvious to run except straight toward the town's own heart, and beyond it, toward the half-finished schoolhouse frame standing directly in the herd's path. "Winifred," Oliver's voice cut through the chaos. He had already wheeled his horse toward her. "Get clear up onto the platform roof now." "The schoolhouse," she shouted back, already moving, not toward safety but toward the hitching rail where her own mare stood tied. "Oliver, the whole frame will be matchwood if that herd reaches it, and half the town's children are gathered at the church social not 200 yards past it." He understood in an instant what she meant to do, and cursed under his breath, because there was no time left to argue about who ought to be doing the dangerous work of turning 300 head of stampeding cattle away from a crowded street, only time to do it. "The old creek crossing," he called to her as she swung up onto her mare, "where I have been laying the bridge footings. If we can turn the front of the herd there, the far bank runs open pasture clear down to the river bottom, nothing in their path but grass." "Then let us turn them," Winifred said, and put her heels to her mare. What followed was the kind of ride neither of them would ever entirely manage to describe afterward to those who had not seen it, though half of Pine Hollow watched it happen from doorways and rooftops with their hearts in their throats. Winifred drove her mare hard along the flank of the stampeding herd, close enough that dust and flying mud stung her eyes, using every trick her father had ever taught her about pressure and flight distance in frightened cattle, angling her horse to push against the herd's leading edge rather than trying to outrun it outright. Oliver came at the opposite flank, driving the other 3 ranchers who had ridden in with him to fan out and add their own pressure, all of them working the herd the way a sheepdog works a flock, not fighting the animal's momentum but bending it, giving the terrified cattle somewhere else to go besides straight through the heart of town. It was desperately close. Twice Winifred's mare stumbled on the uneven ground and nearly went down beneath the crush of hooves close behind, and once a young steer broke from the main body directly toward her, only turning aside at the very last instant when she screamed and waved her hat directly in its face. Oliver, watching from across the herd, felt his heart stop entirely in that moment, and did not breathe easy again until he saw her horse recover its stride. Slowly, foot by hard-won foot, the herd's leading edge began to bend, drawn by the pressure on its flanks toward the open ground along the creek, away from the packed buildings of Main Street, away from the schoolhouse frame, away from the church social where 24 children stood frozen in terror watching the dust cloud approach. The herd poured instead down toward the creek bottom and the wide, open, empty pasture land beyond, where 300 head of cattle could run themselves to exhaustion against nothing more dangerous than good grass and the cold spring water of the creek itself. When the last of the herd had thundered past, and the dust began finally to settle, Winifred reined her blowing, lathered mare to a stop at the very lip of the creek bank, not 30 feet from the raw new timbers of Oliver's half-finished bridge footings, and found she was shaking so hard she could scarcely keep her seat. Oliver reached her a moment later, flinging himself from his own horse and pulling her down into his arms almost before her feet touched the ground, holding her hard against his chest while her whole body trembled with the release of terror held too long at bay. "You reckless, magnificent woman," he said into her hair, his own voice unsteady. "You might have been killed." "So might you," she said against his shirt front, laughing and half sobbing at once. "We are neither of us in any position to lecture the other on recklessness." Oliver Garrett. Behind them, back in the ruined street, Ezra Thorne's plan had unraveled entirely in the chaos of his own making. In the confusion of the stampede, Calloway's horse had been struck a glancing blow by a bolting steer and thrown its rider hard against a hitching post, breaking his arm and leaving him in no condition to resist arrest. Thorne himself, attempting to flee toward the livery stable while every eye in town was fixed upon the disaster in the street, found his path blocked by 3 furious buyers up from Sacramento, whose own wagons had been overturned in the stampede. Men with no particular loyalty to Ezra Thorne, and every reason now to want answers about exactly whose recklessness had cost them their morning, and very nearly their lives. By the time Oliver and Winifred rode back into town, leading the tired, mud-splattered posse of ranchers who had helped turn the herd, they found Ezra Thorne under guard in his own exchange office, Winifred's ledger and sworn statements laid out upon his own desk beside his private books, which one of the Sacramento buyers, a man with considerable experience reading cattle accounts, had already begun comparing with a grim and growing certainty. "The figures do not match," the buyer said, looking up as they entered, "not by a small margin either. Miss Doyle, if what you say about your father is true, I believe you have uncovered a fraud that would answer for a hanging in any court in this state, let alone a simple charge of cattle theft." It took 3 more days for the county sheriff to arrive from Placerville, summoned by a rider Oliver had sent the very afternoon of the stampede, and in that time Thorne sat locked in the town's single jail cell under Oliver's watch, Marshal Prout having quietly resigned his own office rather than face questions about how much he had known and chosen to ignore. When the sheriff finally did arrive, the case against Thorne proved, exactly as the Sacramento buyer had predicted, entirely damning. His own ledgers, once properly examined, revealed nearly 4 years of systematic brand alteration and fraudulent sales stretching across a dozen small ranches in the valley. And though it would take a county court in Placerville some months yet to see full justice done, Ezra Thorne rode east that week in the sheriff's custody, never again to trouble Pine Hollow or any rancher within it. The evening after Thorne's arrest, once the town had begun, cautiously, to breathe easy again, Winifred walked out to the half-finished bridge over Willow Creek, where Oliver was quietly setting the last footing stone by lantern light, unable to leave the work undone even on a night that called by any reasonable measure for rest. "You will wear yourself thin," she said, settling onto a flat rock nearby to watch him work, chasing thieves by day and building bridges by night. "I find I sleep poorly these days regardless of what I do with my hands," he said, setting the stone with careful precision. "There is a great deal on my mind, Winifred, that has nothing to do with Ezra Thorne." "Tell me then." He straightened, wiping his hands on a rag, and came to sit beside her on the rock, close enough that their shoulders touched. "I have spent 6 years since I left you telling myself a wandering man had no business building anything permanent, that roots were a luxury for men steadier and less restless than myself. I do not believe that any longer. I have built a schoolhouse in this town, and I mean to see this bridge finished by summer, and I find, watching you ride down a stampeding herd with more courage than any 3 men I have known, that I do not wish to wander one single step further from wherever you have chosen to plant yourself. Oliver Garrett, she said, her heart suddenly loud in her own ears, are you asking me something, or merely making conversation about lumber? I am asking, he said, taking her hand in both of his, whether you would consider building a life alongside a carpenter who has finally learned the difference between a fortress and a bridge, and who loves you, Winifred Doyle, with every steady, stubborn, badly built plank of himself. I loved you 6 years ago, she said softly, before either of us knew enough of the world to build anything lasting at all. I think I have gone on loving you the whole while, underneath all the hurt of your leaving, though I would not have admitted it to a living soul until this very spring showed me what kind of man you had become. She leaned her head against his shoulder, watching the lantern light dance on the moving water below. Yes, Oliver, I will build a life with you, though I mean to keep teaching and keep this land my father left me, and I will not be managed even by a husband, no matter how much I love him. I would not want a wife who could be managed, he said, turning to press a kiss to her temple. Then, when she lifted her face to his, to her lips properly, slow and certain and full of 6 years' worth of longing, finally answered, I have had quite enough this spring of watching you refuse every hand offered to protect you, only to prove yourself entirely capable of protecting half this valley on your own. I do not wish to manage you, Winifred. I wish only to stand beside you, for as long as you will have me. They were married 3 weeks later, on a warm afternoon in early June, in the finished schoolhouse itself, its raw pine walls decorated with wildflowers gathered from the very meadow where Samuel Doyle's cattle had once grazed. Half the valley in attendance, including the 4 ranchers whose sworn statements had helped bring Ezra Thorne to justice, and the Sacramento cattle buyer who had ridden 2 days back from the county seat, especially to see the matter through to its happy conclusion. Marshal duties in Pine Hollow passed, at the town council's insistence, to a properly appointed county deputy the following month, and Oliver, his brief return to lawing concluded to everyone's satisfaction, hung up his borrowed badge for good and turned his full attention to the bridge over Willow Creek, which stood finished and sturdy by midsummer, exactly as he had promised, bending gently with the current rather than fighting it, precisely as a bridge ought to do. That autumn, on a golden afternoon with the black oaks turning color along the ridge and the mountain snows still months away from their return, Winifred Doyle Garrett stood once more at the fence line of her father's ranch, now legally free and clear of any mortgage or dispute, watching her husband ride up the same path where, half a year before, she had once leveled a rifle at a stranger she believed had helped kill her father. She had no rifle in her hands now. She carried instead a slate and a primer, on her way to the schoolhouse where a dozen ranch children awaited their afternoon lessons. Several of them, the sons and daughters of the very small ranchers whose brands Thorne had once stolen, now able to check their own family's cattle count against the exchange's honest new ledger without fear of being cheated again. Oliver reined up at the fence, dismounting to walk the last stretch beside her, exactly as he had once ridden up alone into a rifle's sight and a lie not his own. You are thinking of that first day, he said, reading her easily now, the way 6 months of hard-won closeness had taught him to do. I am thinking, she said, slipping her hand into his, how strange it is that the most dangerous ground I ever stood on became the very place I found the truest home I have ever known. I refused your protection once, Oliver Garrett, standing right here, and told you I would face whatever came alone. You did, he agreed, lifting her hand to press a kiss against her knuckles. And you very nearly did face it alone, every difficult step of it, right up until a stampede and a stubborn carpenter with a rusty badge decided otherwise. I am glad in the end that you rode in any way, she said, laughing, leaning into him as they walked together toward the schoolhouse and the waiting children, the mended fence behind them, the finished bridge downriver holding steady against the current, and the whole wide golden valley spread out before them, safe now, and entirely peacefully theirs.